Hey there, it's Kali Hashiki to talk to you about healing. I'm answering the question, what is healing? So I base my definition of what healing is on a definition that I heard from Betty Martin many years ago. She said that healing is gaining access to more of ourselves. And I'm going to expand upon that and say that healing is gaining access to those parts of ourselves that were taken from us as a result of trauma, or the parts of ourselves that we sacrificed, and not, I don't want that to sound like it was voluntary, but that we sacrificed in order to survive the trauma and to continually survive after the trauma or in the duration of the trauma. And so by trauma, I don't just mean what we think of as traumas, like isolated incidences or connected incidences. You know, I'm not only talking about things like car accidents or life-threatening illnesses or rape or attempted murder or watching someone else die violently. Those are all definitely things that can cause trauma. But when I'm talking about surviving trauma, I'm also talking about surviving systemic or systems of trauma, like racism. Racism impacts those of us who are subject to it in a way that creates trauma. It's not us who is creating trauma, it's that the racism creates the trauma. The racism is the trauma. So that's true for, surviving racism, surviving sexism, surviving homo hatred or transphobia and trans erasure. That's surviving trauma. And surviving ableism and misogynoir, that particular connection between sexism and racism that is so unique to Black women's experiences. Surviving all those things is surviving trauma. And to survive racism, for example, we have disconnected from parts of ourselves or cut off parts of ourselves or shut down parts of ourselves in order to survive that. And so in that context, healing is gaining or regaining access to those parts of ourselves. And for some of us, for many of us, we actually come into the world, we come into this plane of reality with inherited trauma. Science is just catching up to this recently in the field of epigenetics, where they talk about how trauma changes the DNA and then that gets passed on to your progeny, to your children. We've known that for quite some time, right? So some of us come into the world already cut off from parts of ourselves due to the inherited trauma, and then we come into this beautiful yet fucked up world, and then we are subject to more trauma because of the bodies that we live in. So certain bodies are marginalized or multiply marginalized by the state, and that marginalization can be benign in the case of ignoring, or it can be active in the case of torture or killing and denying access to life-saving things, denying access to education, et cetera, et cetera. I'm getting a little bit off track here. Let me bring it back in. So healing is gaining or regaining access to the parts of ourselves that were either forcibly taken from us during trauma or as a result of trauma, or parts of ourselves that we gave up in order to survive the trauma. So what does healers and healing have to do with erotic embodiment? Well, I'm glad you asked. If you want to know about erotic embodiment, you should stay tuned for my next video. And until I see you again, breathe as deeply as you can, live as fully as you can, and love as wholly as you can. Peace out.